Now for day 7, 8, and 9, we're going to move on to topic 2, which is primarily all of chapter 4 about sampling and experimentation. Now day 7 is just going to focus on section 4.1, which was when we addressed how to take a good sample, what is an SRS, talking about undercoverage and response. Here were the various learning objectives we talked about then. Now, it could be that you're going to be asked to clarify the difference. Is this a sample or is it a population? So do keep that in mind. You may have to use a table of random digits to do some sampling. In terms of sampling methods, we did talk about you can do a stratified random sample, and you can do a cluster sample, or again, our standard SRS that we would do. Remember, a cluster sample is basically taking a mini population. So they're smaller groups that look like our population. A stratified random sample is when you take your group and you put them into strata or like groups. For example, maybe you strata on age or you strata on gender. The one thing you want to keep in mind, if you use the word stratified in a free response, that's only used if it's an observational study. If an experiment is being imposed, then you don't call it a stratification, you call it blocking. So stratification and blocking are really close to each other, except one is for a observational study and one is for an actual experiment where a treatment's imposed. Some of the things to keep in mind are the types of bias that could be encountered, the types of errors that you could see. Some of those errors could include non-response or response bias or the wording of the question. Now, this table here I gave you back in chapter 4, and I like it to kind of help clarify things. So if you're still a little fuzzy on this or want a quick refresher, it's sampling methods and biases that we talked about. Now remember, if you're ever reading a question and they want you to do research or analyze the results in terms of an inference study, if they took a bad sample to start with, you probably shouldn't do it at all. So the bad samples are convenient samples or voluntary response samples. The good types that we do, like an SRS, a stratified sample, or a cluster sample, are good types of sampling structures. Here's just a recollection of how they are done and some examples of how they work that I would encourage you to read. So how to take a good sample, we know there's 3 good methods. Now, even if you have a good sample, you could have some bias in that itself. Now, when you choose the sample, you could have bias. Again, we talked about the convenient sample is just not really a good one to do. A voluntary sample too, calling in on a phone line, is not going to be the greatest. Some of that sampling error you could do is the undercoverage. Are you doing a sample at a bad time of the day? So you're going to get under coverage if you do call certain homes for answers. Maybe a lot of people aren't home. Now there's actually going to be bias or error after you take the sample. So those types that we would encounter are going to be listed here. What you want to keep in mind, non-response bias is a non-sampling error. This happens after the fact, and here's some of the examples for it. The response bias is, again, a non-sampling error. It's just how the people respond. The wording of the question, was it set up good or not? So those could really cause some issues. Now, the other type of error that you can get that is a little more controllable is sampling variability. Sampling variability, they say, is controllable based on your sample size. Just remember, the larger your sample size, the more stable your data is. The less standard deviation, the less spread. The smaller the sample size, the more random the answers you're going to have, and there's going to be more variability and a higher standard deviation. Sort of advice I would give you is if you do have a free response and they ask you to discuss the bias, whenever you discuss the bias, let's say that you said there was response bias. You would say there's response bias and why. They actually want you to also say if it was over or underestimated in that particular scenario. So they're not going to ask you for this directly, but it's implied if they ask you about bias, you want to talk about the direction of the bias. Those are the key things to take away from section 4.1. Go ahead now and try your multiple choice. Again, one response will show up and the answer will show you with some feedback. And then try the free response on here for today. The free response is in your packet, and what you're going to find But it's a problem from 2009. It was question number 3. Remember in the order of questions, question 1 is considered the easiest, but 2 through 5 is not in any difficulty order. So maybe if you page through it, you want to start with this one next. It could be a possibility. Give this one a try, and we'll start off tomorrow talking about some of the key things to be cautious of in your answer. You can also go online into the assignment for this when you're done doing it and pull up the scoring rubric and see how you did.